talking to Yakov about how much he loves LA. But before we get to how much you love LA, how long has it been? You were on the East Coast before this, right? Because you got your PhD at Penn.
I'm a lifelong East Coaster.
Ah,
I grew up on the East Coast. Well, I spent quite a bit of time on the East Coast with my friends out west.
yeah. So you guys both spent time in Philly. Do you miss Philly, Yakov?
Absolutely. I really like Philadelphia. I think
Hey, that's where I am.
oh,
Yeah, I'm in South Philly.
nice. That's I never lived in South Philly, but lived in Grace Ferry. I loved
Oh, that is nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I got to spend 3 days in Philly at a conference when I was an undergrad at a debate conference. And the first thing I didn't get to see Independence Hall. Like I didn't get to see the signing of the Constitution where they did that, but I saw the Liberty Bell and I was like, this is, and so that's why I like Philly.
You would like living in Philadelphia. No,
Yeah.
you loved it.
Yeah, I mean, with your love of Washington, you would love Philadelphia too.
And you love drinking and whiskey.
Yeah.
Exactly. There are places where nobody else likes to live, or nobody else is like, Varsha, everyone else is like, why do you want to live there? And that's Washington, D.C., Boston, and Philly. Like a lot of people probably like Philly, but the people I've talked to are like, why do you want to live in these places?
You would live in a place called Monk's Cafe. That's what I'm thinking.
One of the last defenders of Belgian beer in the Philadelphia area now that the IPAs have taken over the scene.
Exactly.
Oh, that's another thing. I mean, I don't know how Rachel and Yakov feel about this, but there's been a big discourse on my Twitter because like this week I was trying to get to 10K followers on Twitter, but more importantly, I was just trying to convince people that IPAs are like the bane of like society. They're like the devil's drink. And everyone's like, no, Varsha, IPAs are delicious. And I'm like, have you had a Belgian sour? Like a sour beer is where it is at.
I'm extremely basic. I like IPAs.
Oh, no.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with IPAs as long as you have an option to have something else.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion if I'm at a bar and I have an option between beer and any other liquor, even if it's sour beer, I will choose the other liquor. Yeah. So it is 4:03. So I'll introduce our illustrious guests. So today we have Yakov Feygin. He is the associate director in the Future of Capitalism program at Berggruen Institute. So before he was at Berggruen, he was a fellow in history and policy at Harvard, at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He was also the managing editor of the Private Debt Project. He has a PhD in history from UPenn, and his book that he's working on that's going to come out in a couple of years is Building a Ruin, the International and Domestic Politics of Economic Reform in the Soviet Union. It's published under Harvard University Press. So, he works on international and political economy, money, banking, and business history. And so we are excited to have him here.
Hi.
Well, we'll start with the most, I think, important question. As long as we started with IPAs and whiskeys, what are you drinking, Yakov?
So I have something here called an Old Pal, which is just a mix of random stuff that I had when I surveyed my liquor area. Not really even a cabinet. I my space on the kitchen counter that has liquor, and kind of went back into my ex-bartender college days head and remembered that this recipe exists. And it's actually not too bad. I still remember how to make one. And in case I run out, I have a fat tire on standby.
Nice. What about you, Rachel?
I went to a vintage event this weekend, and it was a Roaring 20s kind of affair. And they had tables with different kinds of liquor or beer that you could buy that were from the local area. So I tried Resurgent. It is a custom cask 100 proof bourbon, and it is delicious.
Ooh, fancy. I am having a friend of mine sent me a gift. He was very excited that you can send whiskey through the mail. He is like, this is revolutionary. And he sent me a rye whiskey. It's called, the brand is Rough Rider, and the actual rye is called the Big Stick. It is distilled in New York, so it has a lot to do with Teddy Roosevelt. It has a little picture of a Rough Rider on there. And it is beating Rachel's bottle because it is 121 proof. And honestly, it is a glass of like chocolatey and vanilla goodness. I love it. I'm really in love with it. Yeah. So I guess we should just start. So I never got to take a Russian history class in either college or in grad school. So I guess my first question is, Yakov, when you got to grad school, how did you decide that you were going to study the Soviet Union?
Um, well, just kind of a confluence of things. I was born in a place called that doesn't exist anymore in the Soviet Union. Uh,
Ah,
only had a few years left on it, but
wait, where were you born?
I was born in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg.
Okay.
So I grew up with it. I was more or less raised by my grandparents and my parents' work. So I grew up with a lot of stories, especially from my grandfather, who kind of went through everything you could go through if you were a Jewish guy born in 1915 in Belarusia. Uh,
Wow.
Yeah.
that he just shouldn't have survived, but he did. Just like really did grow up with it. I didn't think I would do Soviet history in particular, modern Russian history, but I fell into it. I started my first two history classes were kind of just accidentals because I was going to do something like economics or political science, or even I initially had delusions of being an engineer, but quickly realized I did not have the chops to be one. So, I took a class in the history of the Cold War, and I took a class actually in environmental history, and I realized that was a very good complement to understanding economics. In particular, I got really into the Cold War class, and as a burn, I decided to actually learn to read Russian in college. And there we go. And eventually I figured that's an interesting area to think about, because if you want to understand how society works, I always think the Soviet Union is kind of a null hypothesis on a lot of modernity, right? Like, well, the way I always lecture on it is, the main question I think of the Soviet century isn't why the Soviet Union collapsed. It's how the hell did it last so long? And
So what's the
about,
short answer you give to students when they ask you how does it last so long?
the short answer is luck, improvisation, and brute force can get you, a brute force floor effect can get you a lot. It's a really strange society, right? For obvious reasons. It's a very misunderstood society. But I think by understanding it, you can understand a lot of other things, because it's missing certain features, right? That you take as quote unquote normal in an operational monetary or economic system. Then when you realize those systems, how important those things are, you kind of look gradually at other places.
So how did your focus sort of change, or how has it changed over the years? Because you were a part of the private debt project, which is not necessarily concentrated on Russian history, but you worked there as a fellow, correct?
Well, as an editor, it was a
Okay.
job. Look, I'll be brutally honest, right? I don't really care about Russian history that much. I care about it because, for its own sake. I care about it because I think it, as I said, it reveals many things, right? But to me, it's just I always just cared about problems and how things are put together. And I think, like, I graduated college in 2009 into the teeth of the Great Recession, and I quickly realized, the job market was dead. I started my first job and was fired within 2 weeks because liquidity had died. Right, there was literally no cash to pay people. And then the second thing was, you realize you just didn't understand this stuff. So kind of while bumming around underemployed, and then doing like a grad degree, realizing again, not going to get you anywhere. And then doing another one, and realizing it's not going to get you anywhere. I guess.
You're painting a rosy picture for the two of us here.
Well, I think you guys are actually way better off in some way in your cohort. I think things are actually changing for the better. But at that point, I was just looking for better answers than what like my undergraduate econ degree could give me, or my undergraduate history degree, for that matter, could give me. Right? We didn't barely had any economic history in my undergraduate degree just didn't really exist. I mostly did diplomatic, and I touch on like little political economy topics that way, right? It was always like my instinctualness to think about things from a material point of view. So when I got into grad school, you had to do something to do with the Cold War, something to do with the Soviet Union, but I also just knew I didn't have the tools. So eventually I fell in with something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I kind of just fell in with the group there. And then one thing led to another, and I was offered a job by a foundation actually based in Philly to, help out editing this journal that the foundation wanted to edit, which would do research on financial instability. And so I did that, and I learned a lot. And I kind of slowly but surely kind of picked up a set of intuitions that I think have served me relatively well, right?
So
And the other thing was very mercenary. I knew there would be a job market problem when I got out, so I wanted to build up some other skills. And I needed money, and the money was good, so why not?
That doesn't hurt.
For all the grad students on here, they say you can't work on the side in grad school. They're lying. They're not allowed to do that, first of all, to tell you that. Second of all, it's a really good idea to pick up a side gig if you can, even if you're on fellowship. If you have the time and capacity and the opportunity, do it.
definitely, that is excellent advice to anybody who is a grad student. I will take that advice, and I have taken it. So is that the kind of work that you're doing now at Berggruen under this future of capitalism position?
Yeah. I mean, a little more than that. I'm doing a lot more writing, a lot more public facing rather than academic writing, which is really interesting because, again, you can build, like, being a historian is like being a mechanic in some ways, I think, right? You've got to really, or like a watchmaker, at least for me, you got to put things together in a lot of minuteness. You can't really throw out intuition, right? Based on your sources the way you can when you're writing like as a pundit or as like a theorist. So it's been nice to do that, right? To like think as a theorist a bit too, right? That they're just different genres. One's more of a kind of constructing genre and one's more of a synthesizing one. I always like the synthesizing stuff better than I did the constructing because it's just more fun.
Definitely.
But yeah, like most of this job is administrative, to be honest. So I minister a lot. I kind of have to be on phone calls all day, dealing with fellows, try to build out research agendas for the thing. So yeah.
But one of the reasons I asked that about the future of capitalism is one of the most important articles I had to read in undergrad was the Fukuyama's End of History, right? And I had to read that mainly because I was taking a class in American foreign policy, and we finished our unit on the end of the Cold War, and so when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and also a lot of other things were happening in 2016 with global populism and the like, everybody and their mother was like, oh man, Fukuyama was really wrong. So I was just wondering what your take is when it comes to this question about whether or not just America, but has not history, but does capitalism have a future?
Oh, I mean, I always joke that as they hired the Soviet historian, I always say, well, you know what the future of capitalism is. I mean, I think it certainly does. I also think it's very hard to think of the horizon of imagination of what a non-capitalist system is very difficult to actually come up with. But I also think the spectrum of what is capitalist is like almost, impossibly big. So while, I do think like, I agree with a lot of people that the history of capitalism literature doesn't want to define capitalism, and we should define capitalism when we say something. On the other hand, I think it is a widely evolving, hard to pin down system. So I don't know. I don't want to make those kind of predictions. I definitely don't think it's going to look the way it used to in any shape or form. I think we're kind of heading. I definitely think neoliberalism isn't really. I think it's kind of. It's not necessarily. It's too soon to say it's over, but I think we're actually might be heading that way. It's very that might not be even the worst thing in the world, like the best thing in the world, because it could always get worse, right? That's it could always be worse, but hopefully it'll be better. Yeah, but with Fukuyama, technically, I don't think Fukuyama thinks it's the end of history anymore.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting because I found from listening to some of the lectures you've done and some of the podcasts and reading some of your work that you have a really sometimes different definition of some terms like inflation. I found your definition really interesting in your conversation about wealth inequality, income inequality, and asset inequality. So that's been a big thing on everyone's mind too. Every time you look at the Times, the thing that I just posted on Twitter the other day, everyone's worried about inflation. So, I mean, can you explain your theory of inflation?
Well, it's not my theory of inflation.
Oh.
It's just a story of inflation, right?
Because we don't really know what it is, right?
No.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about inflation and why it's such an interesting subject for a historian is that every inflation is, different in its own way. And it's always contingent, I think. And well, an essay I think the person that most influenced me in doing history is Charlie Mayer, right? Like I remember that, like reading that stuff, and it was blowing me away. His methodological essay on revealed preference, his consigning the 20th century to history, but also like he edited this book in I think 1985, and it was about politics of global inflation and stabilization, right? And it was presenting a very different theory of inflation than I had ever heard, which is, that inflation is primarily a political phenomenon on some level, that it is really a social and political kind of conflict over an adjustment process, right? And to an extent, inflation is always a choice to avoid that conflict, to avoid that final redistribution, that kind of social peace. And, that was really provocative. And, as you kind of go on, you begin to realize there are non-monetarist theories of inflation. And in fact, the monetarist theory of inflation, as we did the work in Private Debt Project, that was actually one thing we did at actual in-house research. One of the things we did in-house was, doesn't really hold, right? Yes, there is a tendency for the money supply to increase, like M2 to increase when there's inflation, right? That's the classic theory that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon that we've had in the 70s. That doesn't actually, it's a necessary condition maybe, but it's definitely not the sufficient one.
Interesting.
And there's actually an essay by my kind of really close intellectual friends, actually, Skanda Amarath and Alex Williams, they just put out of a group called Employ America, which is a wonderful think tank. And they kind of formalized this, I think, thinking bouncing around the kind of left to center econ world, that inflation is actually a real side phenomenon. It's a supply side phenomenon, right?
Okay.
If you have rising wages, if you have rising money supply, etc., and the price is catching, but the price level overall doesn't change, right? Wages are catching up, prices are moving in unison. That's not inflation. That's just called a good time to be alive, right? What does happen is when what becomes problematic is when, instead of expanding capacity to meet the new demand caused by higher wages, firms can't do that for one reason, or don't want to do that for one reason or another, right? And that's when you see price increases in a very simple model, right? Because instead of, keeping the price at the same level or relatively same level, low levels, in order to avoid new entrants for whatever imperfect competition reasons, and expanding the capacity or running at full capacity, making new investments to make more stuff, figure out new ways to do it, you add a markup onto the price. That's not, again, what you get in Econ 101 textbook. No, but it is like older theory of inflation. It's like what we would call the post-Keynesian theory of inflation. That's President Herod and Koletsky and all those kind of old Cambridge writers. And I think it's more realistic, right? And it tells us a lot about, when it happened and when it didn't. I'm going to steal from Skanda again because we were riffing on this. There's what were the 2 years the highest since 1950? When has non-residential fixed investment been the highest in American history? What 2 years? Under what president, let's say, because I don't remember the years on the top of my head. I remember the president, but it's not what you would expect.
I'm assuming Nixon and Reagan?
Nope.
Carter?
Yep.
Interesting.
So what's happening under Carter?
Yeah.
Whereas most, it's oil. It's the domestic oil supply. It's the pipelines.
Yeah.
But then under early Reagan, you have a series of bank failures, right? Related to debt, like boomed from that, but you get the infrastructure is still there. And that's why you have the oil price crash. It's because the US government, under Carter and starting under Nixon Ford a little, very, very much encouraged the creation of domestic oil supply and capacity. And guess what that did to a key bottleneck that was causing the great inflation, stagflation of the 70s? Pop.
Right. And had something to do with Vietnam as well?
Well, okay, that's a less direct story. I'm actually writing a paper on this, on comparing stagflation in the Soviet Union and the US with Tim Barker at Harvard. He's a grad student there. It does have to do with Vietnam, but not in the way people think it does. It's not the deficit that kills you and gives you inflation in Vietnam. It's that Vietnam, one, creates imbalances. There's a huge military spending spree, and that takes away investment from consumer goods while at the same time increasing wages. That's like a little rough story of it. So you have more money chasing fewer goods, but the problem isn't on the wages side, it's on the expansion of consumer goods side, right? At the same time, you also have the Bretton Woods system just doesn't work very well, let's be honest here. So you have like this pressure on, I'm sorry, my assistant just texted me. I thought it was like really busy. She's not really my assistant, my RA right now on a project that we're doing. But essentially what that set and that fed back through the capital controls into a worsening and worsening situation. That's actually, I think, and Greg Brew, who you guys are having on very soon, can talk a little better towards this, but it incentivizes oil and other primary commodity exporters to move their price up. And that's actually the political background of the first OPEC oil shock. It's over, politics, right? Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there is a larger background here that breaks the initial price agreements that are with oil producers and other primary commodity producers that are in place in the 60s and keep those prices relatively stable. However, it's not deadly. Yeah, you'll get a little bit of price inflation, but the economy would have adjusted. It's that it had, I think, these second order shocks that really made the 70s what the 70s were. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a pretty rough story of it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's actually very telling for where we are today with all these kind of fears of this story of, okay, is this going to be, are we losing control of inflation expectations, or is this some kind of transitory thing with the reopening? I think it's the latter. Okay. And I think, I do think it's the latter. I think it's pretty certain, and we're already seeing the prices start to reverse. Now, I'm not necessarily sure that's always a good thing. I think those prices are high because they show vulnerabilities that we need to fix.
So for people who read the news and read, oh yeah, the Fed is deciding to raise interest rates or et cetera, or they're doing something with interest rates. But basically these people, when they read this, they do not want to actually figure out what this interest rate is or why raising interest rates actually matters. When recently, I think it was recently, Yellen announced that they are trying to raise interest rates. Is that generally a good thing for combating inflation, or are you sort of arguing that like this idea of combating inflation isn't really necessary anymore?
Well, it's necessary, but let me take that on a couple of levels. Just on a tactical pedestrian level, I actually think there's a huge overreaction to what the Fed said.
Okay.
I think the market's drastically overreacted. This is an investment advice, by the way. It's Series 7, yada, 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 not investment advice. I think the market definitely is overreacting. I think if you look at the, the way I watched Powell's press conference yesterday, and he sounded very, very dovish. You saw Bullard shoot his mouth today, but he's always been hawkish. And if you look at the dot plots, right, which are like the way each governor expects, not each governor, I'm sorry, MOC member, expects the hiking trajectory to go. I think most of those are regional governors, and they don't actually have much voting power on the board. And I think the board members are actually still fairly dovish.
Interesting.
Now, with the interest rate being a tool to combat inflation, obviously the interest rate combats inflation, right? There is a place for it. But, it's a broadsword, not a scalpel. And what that means effectively is if you're bringing up interest rates, you're really stopping inflation by worsening the economy. There's no other way to, right? Like you are making it harder to invest, you're making it harder to borrow, and you are slowing primarily wage growth, right? Because that was I think fortunately dying framework, right? But there was this idea that, wages are growing too fast, too high. We got to slow the economy because that causes inflation, right? That's a broadsword. That's a reason. I think that's a huge reason for inequality. For many reasons, right? Is that we've been doing this since the early 80s. There really probably are better ways of dealing with inflationary tendencies in an economy. I'm just not that concerned about inflation in the long run. Because, as a historian, over 300 years of interest rates, they've been going down, like almost like in a straight line, with a very strange exception in the mid-20th century due to world wars and such.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's probably a kind of tendency towards that. The other thing is, if you really are worried about inflation, you should be hitting up, like doing the Green New Deal ASAP, right? Because what is a major input cost on the side of an enterprise's input? It's energy. Guess what is falling rapidly in its price? It's green energy. If the right infrastructure existed, it would just naturally outcompete dirty energy for the most part, I think. And it would actually reduce the input price. Like, in fact, like my friend Karthik is working on a kind of research project and trying to figure out what this would look like. But it, like, very formally, but yeah, it would actually be, you're more worried about deflation in that situation rather than inflation.
Hey,
right?
So you heard it here first. Yakov endorses the Green New Deal. We're gonna see an AOC tweet as soon as this episode is up.
Yeah, those sirens were going off.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was very telling those sirens were going off as soon as you said we should implement the Green New Deal immediately. I think building off of this like really fascinating discussion on inflation, whether or not we've been combating it in maybe a too intense way for too long. You've written a lot about, corruption and kleptocracy and its role in economic inequality. How does corruption and kleptocracy in general sort of differentiate or maybe sort of highlight the similarities or differences between not just the Soviet Union and the United States back then, but Russia and the US today? Like, is there like a huge similarity between that, or is there a huge difference?
There's an old joke about like us just being better at covering it up. I don't actually think that's true to a degree, probably. I mean, the Soviet collapse to me is just like the ultimate collapse of like an industrial state, right? Like it's it aspires to be everything industrial in 20th century, right? The question is, after the collapse, how do you manage it? How do you manage that collapse? And I think without a lot of luck and political commitment, it was almost impossible to manage it without, entrenched kind of interest stealing, like robbing the thing blind. I'm a Rousseau pessimist in many ways because I just don't think there was a way of saving the thing by the late 80s. And I don't know if that disaster could have been avoided at that point. I think there was too much running against it.
Well, what kind of disasters can we avoid, though?
Is kleptocracy affecting us?
Yeah.
It's definitely affecting us as a kind of like social structure that is, I think, a natural byproduct of, like, I think you guys are referring to that article about deflationary coalitions that I wrote, right? Like, it's definitely a natural version of a deflationary coalition. It's just that, over there we call it kleptocracy because it's one form of managing power and surplus. Over here, we call it the San Francisco Homeowners Association that won't let apartment buildings be built. Obviously, these are degrees of difference, but like in many ways, these are entrenched interest groups that aren't actually pro-growth. They want is existing owned assets to accumulate incomes faster than growth, right? R has to be bigger than G. And this is where I don't agree with McKinney. I think G is a policy variable. We can grow if we wanted to. We just need to manage the growth.
Another hot take, Yakov Feygin does not agree with Thomas Piketty.
And by the way, this is why I'm actually like somewhat optimistic. I think the US has all the ingredients to grow like gangbusters. We just haven't been taking the opportunity. We have a pretty good demographic profile. We have a lot of people that want to come here. If we don't have a good demographic profile, American households are actually in better shape than they were before COVID, an aggregate. That's kind of proves that you can actually spend your way out of a recession pretty damn well, even one that's like the most ridiculous exogenous shock ever. And then and you have virtually unlimited, actually, I won't say virtually, you have unlimited borrowing capacity. Like the US could just borrow gangbusters. There's no budget, like just keep spending money, right? And you have so little economic development compared to where you need it, right? Like there used to be a joke in post-Soviet Russia that it was so underdeveloped, the consumption levels were so low that if you could throw a stick, it would plant like a store would grow. I think that's the same way with industrial infrastructure in the United States. We've gotten rid of so much of it. We're so behind the curve that we could easily hit very high growth rates if we play our cards right. And in fact, we're heading there, I think, already.
This is fascinating because this is fascinating because I thought this was going to be like a depressing conversation about the future of like the American economy. But like, honestly, it's just proof that we aren't doing enough, right? It's not we're not screwed. We're just not doing enough.
No, we're actually the least screwed major industrial power in the world, I think, actually.
So the dream's not over?
Well, it just means we have a different dream, right? Like, I mean, I think we're not screwed. Like, we just need to do it.
So I think before we move to audience questions, and if you do have an audience question, make sure to put it in the Q&A.
We're talking about like my like pundit job, which is like I always embarrassed.
Yeah. I do.
I'm a historian, guys.
I know. I do want to ask an actual historian question. So your book is called Building a Ruin. So can you tell us a bit about, without spoiling the book, how did you decide? What are you actually talking about in this book when it comes to economic reform and domestic politics in the Soviet Union, and what, without spoiling it, what is like sort of the conclusion you sort of draw?
All right, well, I'll spoil it. Whatever, you'll still read it if it ever comes out. Look, my argument is pretty like simple. My argument is essentially my like that Steve Kotkin is in many ways right about what Stalinism was. That it was this idea of squaring a circle where you had the revolution that won in Russia, but nowhere else in the world. That was exactly not what they were thinking. So how do you govern Russia? And, you know, Stalin came up with socialism in one country, which I argue is actually like an incredibly coherent political economic worldview, that you have to do all the things, you have to do this shock growth, but without any, as little foreign capital as possible. Not foreign technology, which is very different. They use plenty of foreign technology, as we know, but with as much foreign internal capitalization as possible in order to build the Soviet Union up as a socialist great power. Because, you know, Stalin, somewhat of a good reader of Lenin, you know, what happened in 1917 was the chains of imperialism broke. There was this moment of opportunity. The revolution took place, told in one place, and that inter-imperial conflict will always lead to these opportunities, and that is the revolutionary process, is this like combination of class and geopolitics. Question is, by the 50s, that logic doesn't work anymore, right? You actually have a capitalist ideological superpower called the United States, and it's actually like beyond an empire. It's you know, as Adam Tooze says, the world's actually first hegemon. It's both the center of an economic system and a military system, right? And it is managing a capitalist alliance structure. And, you know, revolution ain't around the corner. So how do you live this how do you continue being the Soviet Union? And what I argue is essentially the Soviet Union decided to beat the United States at its own game, which is the politics of productivity, which is the politics of growth. But that's not what its system was designed to do. The system was actually pretty rationally designed to do what Stalin wanted it to do. So that tension is essentially the kind of boilerplate, is that tension is what drives, I think, a lot of the structural dynamics of Soviet-style economies in the post-Stalin era. And I think we can examine that tension, right? We can test that theory, and we can get through it by looking at the reform process as a kind of way, as a kind of, I guess, a microscope at it, right? Because it gives us a lot of revealed preferences, because in the reform schemes of these economists that I started out studying, that I was initially going to write a purely intellectual history, and then I realized I don't like intellectual history, right?
Don't tell Nils.
I know. Well, Nils says it's still an intellectual history. I call it an institutional one. And like, this is like a running joke. He's like, well, what we really are like intellectual historians of institutions. So like, by studying these like reformist ideas and how and why they don't take root, even though many of them make sense, right? You can you can get at the revealed preferences of the Soviet elite and how they change over time, and actually how they don't, right? How like they can't actually get over this contradiction. And I think in the end, it's that contradiction that kills them.
That's a great summary, and I still will read it.
I definitely still will read it. Yeah. Again, I know I'm a nerd, but I definitely will read it.
My favorite person in the world, Mikhail Kaletsky, who was like kind of like that's the software, that's the biosystem it runs on, is Kaletsky, Herod, and stability issues. So there's economics in there. There's definitely like an economic presupposition there. Mm-hmm. It's actually really funny. I think we should be reading more of these guys out of like the post-Keynesian tradition as historians, because, you know, we read philosophers, we read Foucault, and then we graft and test those theories in the archives, and we use them as interpretive lenses. We can read stuff beyond that as historians and see how that might inform us.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to get to some audience questions. So I'm just going to turn the tide just a little bit and go back to what we were talking about before with inflation, because one of our audience members, Anthony, has a question about deflation. So he asks how deflation or rising credit rates affect real estate prices in major metro areas.
Well, that's the really interesting part, right? Deflation does increase real estate prices. Because if you're in a low growth situation, I think by very much in design in the United States, right? You have no incentive to build new capacity, and you have people whose livelihoods are actually dependent on their home equity, right? They've for like the social base of neoliberalism, it exists. It's a popular movement in some degree. I would argue there are a lot of people who, at least for a while, made out great, right? You don't have high wage growth, but you have high asset appreciation, right? All of that lines up with a more geographically concentrated economy, and supply and demand begins to bite. And that's why all of our houses, when we live on the coasts, are so damned expensive, and none of us will ever be homeowners. That's the depressing part, unless we do something about it and we start building a lot more capacity, right? Matt's, there was in a Twitter exchange with Matt Klein and the guy who actually works for the Government Statistical Bureau about like how much is housing really the weight of the PCE, given that a lot of Americans own. But yeah, certainly those things are going up. And if you do want to reduce the headline index, right? And that's the other thing is like inflation is made up in some way, right? It's just like a selective basket for like a typical household's consumption that like we construct. If you want to move that basket down, yeah, you build a lot more houses and here suddenly that thing moves down. Now, the problem is we've also lost the capacity to build so many of those houses since we haven't built many, especially since 2008. Like we've literally lost, like infamously now, lumber capacity. Lumber, like we have fewer lumber mills. I don't know fewer, but like it's a very different, I don't know the details. There's a podcast that I can tell you that would tell you about it, but we have a very different lumber industry, than there used to be. We don't have as many construction workers as there used to be. We have home builders themselves apparently that are skittish because they're afraid of a rerun of 2008 because we did such a bad job containing that one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wait, so building on that, one question that I didn't get to ask is like there's been a huge discussion since like, COVID hit its like 6-month mark or maybe after that of like we have a labor shortage now. But like there are two types of people who argue that. Some people argue we don't have a labor shortage, people just don't want to pay workers enough. And other people are like, no, we do have a labor shortage. Where do you sort of fall on that? Like, can Amazon pay its workers?
I'm very much in the middle. I definitely think we don't pay people enough. And like, this is the true cost of a society, like coming to bear. Like we actually, like there was a Joe Weisenthal of Bloomberg, I think said it really well. The yuppie lifestyle like lived off of like underemployed people. And now we're going to have to pay more for our workers. That's one element of it. The other element of it is, my understanding of it is that, and I am not a specialist on this, I can refer you to people who really know this data inside and out. People just changed their lifestyles during COVID. A lot of people went back to school. A lot of people, they had the money to actually go back to school for the first time with these unemployment benefits. They had time to choose, like take time and readjust their job and like expect their geographies. And, like many people, I was guilty of this, we thought we'd have these 1 million+ job growths because we assumed the economy is like a machine that you could turn on and off. But let's not forget, we lost more than 500,000 people. Come on. Like we're not machines here. There are going to be scars to this. And there's a whole really unpleasant and fascinating gender dynamics to this. And this was the first women's recession in a long memory, right? Most recessions until COVID were male driven, actually.
Wow.
This one is the exact opposite because it was service jobs that were hit the most. And then you had school closings. You had increased care work at home. And that's actually a huge driver of this. Women can't go back into work yet. Not until all the schools reopen, not until we rebuild our childcare system. That actually, again, says if you don't like inflation, if you want more of a labor force, you want to invest in childcare. You want to invest in elder care because that brings, like, that's verifiably true. Like I was just reading the papers on this for for some congressional testimony I'm helping draft up by one of our fellows. It's like, yeah, no, verifiably true. You need childcare, or if you want to like that, there's like these huge multipliers to that. That's a huge part of the story. I mean, what's really fascinating, I think, is, if you look at the job numbers for April, March, those two infamous misses, we don't know yet on May. First of all, by historical standards, they're great. Second of all, not in the service or hospitality industry that you've got the misses where everyone's complaining about UI. It's in first construction and second in manufacturing, which you would be like confused by, like why would those two areas miss, right? That's where like factory orders through the roof right now. They can't keep up. Housing orders through the roof. They can't keep up. Now, why are they missing? Well, they're at capacity because there are supply line disruptions, right? So for example, infamously in the microchips, right? We've all read the chip shortage stuff. My buddy Hassan, who's your neighbor, actually, I just realized, he's like the man. Has become a minor celebrity because he wrote his PhD diss on the semiconductor industry and then went to work in industry, never did academia for a while, and now is like this go-to guy. That literally idled supply lines. That's why we had too few cars, because there was just the factories in Taiwan had to limit their output. And actually even more so, no one thought the US government would be so good at its fiscal response. So everyone cut their orders because they were getting ready for Great Depression 2.0. And that's going to take time to come back online, but that means idle workers, even in very high demand industries. That's what the cross sectionals on I think these employment reports are telling us. Again, I'm not the biggest specialist in this, but like I can look over some numbers, bring some historians' intuition to it, and I can tell you that.
Yeah. So you said a lot of people went back to school. Where do you think growth is going to happen in this post-COVID sort of economy?
Oh boy, that's $1 million question. Literally, because if I knew that, I would have $1 million. Look, I think we're going to see a lot of capex by firms now. We're going to be ideally seeing more capital expenditure. I think what this has taught companies is they need resilience, right? That's definitely going to be one part of it. You're gonna, and the other thing is, we're gonna see investment hopefully into automation finally. One of the things is everyone's saying, oh, the robots are taking our jobs, right? The robots are taking our jobs. Well, they aren't, and that's actually a problem. In the United States, they're not, because our labor is so damn cheap relative to our productivity that, if I'm McDonald's, instead of having an automatic ordering queue system, I'm just going to hire 2 people to do it instead of that upfront expense. If you get a little more labor power, yeah, there are going to be some lost jobs, but those are exactly the jobs we want to lose. We want to build enough of a welfare state, a retraining state and stuff, like an active labor policy to just put those people into higher productivity jobs. And actually the data, like the experimental data that I've read, is that's actually a process even markets don't do so badly, right? There's all these evidence that higher minimum wages actually just lead to reallocation of labor to more efficient uses pretty damn well. There's this San Francisco study I keep harping on about because it's absolutely brilliant. It did these guys essentially there was a wage bump for restaurant employees in San Francisco. Guys went on Yelp, scanned Yelp reviews before and after, and what they found essentially, even controlling for price, it was the shitty restaurants that closed down. The ones that were good still worked.
I'm shocked.
So essentially, we've been kind of subsidizing shitty companies with our low wages. Hopefully eventually they'll close, or like we'll have more innovative ones, and then that's where we'll get capex.
Interesting. So it's like the kind of nice version of creative destruction.
Yeah,
nice in the sense that you're getting rid of the shitty companies.
Yeah, I mean that's how capitalism should work, but in equilibrium, capitalism doesn't always work very well.
Yeah. So one question that I have, it's not asked by our audience, but we ask a lot of our guests this, is when you were teaching, I know you don't get a chance to teach anymore, were there any like pop culture stuff that you had a chance to like reference? Like, were there any movies that you showed to your students? Is there a movie that you would actually be like, this is a good representation of the Soviet Union?
Oh man. There's one movie I always showed. I showed it a couple of classes. I made it absolutely optional. Because that movie will trigger you. It's called Come and See, and it's one of the best movies ever made, and it's actually co-written by a historian, and it's an absolute horror show. It's a war film about like the partisan war in Belarus, and it's actually incredibly historically accurate, and because of that, it is utterly horrifying. It's also shot in this like extremely psychedelic style that makes the horror really visceral. I remember showing scenes of it my first time TAing like which was a World War II class, and I just got like people came up to me afterward going like, you can't show that. But see, if you want to see a historically accurate film, Come and See. That movie, I can like, I actually once took a ex of mine. She insisted on wanting to see like a film, like a screening of it in like mini film festival that gets run above this like French place in South Philly. Actually, I think you might know about it, Rachel.
Oh, where is it? Is it IFC House?
Yeah, I think so, or something like that. I don't remember where it is, but it's like literally like a little loft above a French restaurant.
Oh, Bistro La Mignette.
Yes. So they showed it. And I was like, this is not a film to be taken lightly. I don't think people know what they're getting into. And I remember just like usually there are applause at the end of the film and stuff. Dead silence and a few sobs.
Oh my God. Now I really want to see this movie. Based on this question, Mike in the audience, he asked if there's any comment on the recent movie that came out in 2017, Death of Stalin. Did you get to watch that? And did you find it funny or wildly inaccurate? Because I found it hilarious.
What sucks is I think the movie's not bad, but I just didn't find it that funny. I found it really funny. I really like that, like his stuff. Like, what's his name? The
Steve
director.
Buscemi?
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. The Italian guy. What's his name?
I'm blanking on his name of the director. One sec.
Because he did Veep, and I absolutely love Veep. Like, it's one of the funniest things. I love banter. Like, I love really good, like, insults and banter. I didn't find it like that funny. I just also, I think he got a lot of things right, actually.
I watched it with a Russianist friend of mine who's a grad student who's a Russianist in the department. And he's like, this movie is wildly inaccurate, but also wildly accurate about certain things.
Exactly. That's like the best way to summarize it. He got like the personalities extremely wrong, I think, in some degree. And like the historical details are like atrocious. Like Stalin doesn't have kids and they're not involved in this. Like, well, he has kids, but they're definitely not involved in this. Oh, this is absolute like lunatic. Like, it's just not true. Like, none of this went down that way. But like, it's still accurate. I don't know how else to put it.
I think it really and also the director you're talking about is Armando Iannucci. From
what I remember, and like Veep's one of my favorite shows because they're just insulting each other constantly in more and more creative ways, and I like that. It's funny.
Yeah.
I'm also huge, like the Producers is like my favorite movie. Because it's like surreal and like absurd. For some reason, I didn't like Death of Stalin as much. Other than Zhukov, he was amazing.
Zhukov was my favorite. And I think the reason I like Death of Stalin so much, and I like Veep and all these other things, is like they really do get the fact that like they don't call it this because they're movie makers and they're actors, but like as a historian, I'm like, they really get the fact that contingency is a real thing. right?
Yes.
Like none of this is preordained. All of this could go to shit at any moment, and like that's what you feel when
Yeah.
you're watching Death of Stalin.
Absolutely. It's that, like, I think that's so right, like, especially like Rachel, I am so sorry. I don't know what you work on.
Well, I mean, I was gonna say I am a medievalist like Matt, so I'm
Okay.
the fill-in medievalist for tonight. And I've never
So
taken an
you're a real
economics
historian,
course.
not a journalist, right? Not a
And
journalist.
I was
But
actually going to ask you not so much about movies, and I don't want to interrupt your thought, but when you get a chance, can you tell people like me, like, should we be listening to NPR's Planet Money? Like, where should ignoramuses like myself go for actual
best
economic?
economics podcast you can find.
Okay.
I'll give you two. I'm a little afraid they might be a little too inside baseball, but like I absolutely adore both of them, and I've been on both of them.
Oh, okay.
The first one is Odd Lots, which is a Bloomberg podcast, and it's like basically it's got this cult following. Like if you can refer to Odd Lots episodes, you could probably get a job. Everyone listens to. This is where you'll get your hot lumber takes, as I call it.
I like that.
And the other one is Macro Musings that David Beckworth runs. One of the nicest guys you'll ever meet in this kind of industry. He runs out of the Mercatus Center, but don't be fooled. It's not what the Mercatus Center usually puts out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. I've put them both in the chat for people to see if they're interested in now, learning the inside baseball of economics and, maybe getting a job because they've listened to these two podcasts and they can reference these episodes. But there was one last question that I have to ask, and it goes back to this idea of like contingency. Michael in the audience, he asks, is like, what is it that you think was missing from the Soviet Union that made it surprising that it lasted as long as it did? Right? Like, because you talk a lot about luck and contingency, and that's why the Soviet Union lasted. But like, why is it that like some people who like to beat their chest and be like USA, USA can be like, yeah, the US won the Cold War. What is it the US had that the Soviet Union didn't have?
I think the United States had less of an idea fixe of what its system like was to be, if I'm going to be grand about it. I think the Soviet Union, like on the top level, I think the Soviet Union really had a, Steve Kotkin, who I keep referring to, who I really like, he kind of almost implies, like he has this great article called Modern Times, in which he talks about essentially the Soviet Union as trying to embody modernity, right? And the question is, okay, when you get to being modern, what comes next? And in many ways, for the Soviet Union, being modern meant being American. And then when you get to like industrial modernity, you start having a crisis of industrial modernity. I just don't think it has many options on the way out, partially because each exit out of industrial modernity involves either a redistribution up or a redistribution down somehow. Excuse me. I mean, the Soviet Union is not very good at redistribution. In terms of concrete things, the Soviet Union is a very strange welfare state. It's actually if you guys want to read a great new history book, my dear friend, my dear friend Christy Ironside, my partner in intellectual crime, just came out with hers. It's called The Valley of Aruba. What she kind of shows is the Soviet welfare state is extremely job-based. It's extremely based on trying to keep you at work. It doesn't have an unemployment system. Everyone's got to have a job. Doesn't mean the job's got to work. Doesn't have a room for that. It's extremely uneven. It's got incredibly. It doesn't. Sorry, I was distracted by something. It flashed past my window. So there's that. It doesn't have money in the conventional sense. I mean, it certainly does. Like again, Christie shows it does, but then it doesn't have. The purchasing power doesn't really, the idea of par value doesn't work as well. And actually, if you study Western monetary history, par value is really hard to get, even in an advanced economy. It takes a lot of institutional innovation, central banking regulation to get a dollar to be one thing and more or less the same thing across the country. It doesn't really have that by design. It doesn't really have any kind of price mechanism or feedback to adjust. So it's a very unique place. It's a unique version of modernity. But I sometimes think we are too confident in our own economic system's ability to do all those things. And those are also very contingent for us, I guess.
Yeah. I see you're onto your beer now.
Oh,
so
yeah. This is one of the funnest things I've ever done on a Zoom. So I'm like, I'm putting him back. You're gonna get pure.
This has been great. Like, if I had more time, I would ask you questions that relate to my dissertation, because I'm really interested in how this is very little to the dissertation, but I'm really interested in how the Soviet Union is dealing with Bretton Woods and Bretton Woods' failure in the 1970s. Like, that's like a totally separate question.
Do you know how many hours in the archive I've wasted trying to figure that out? And then
wait, you couldn't find an answer?
Well, the answer was they're not really plugged into a global monetary system, right? Like the Soviet Union essentially runs its foreign, like if you look at I could draw this if I had like the balance, I still could. But let's say if I draw the balance sheet of the Soviet budget, FX, gold, all of that stuff, it's like a different account. It doesn't transmit into internal prices, right? Oh. They run a almost purely like, this is gonna. There's a certain book that argued that this isn't the case, and I think that book's extremely wrong. They run, if you look from an accounting point of view, like they run their FX book completely outside of any kind of operation. It's minimally necessary trade. So if you're going through the archives on that stuff, what they're worried about is like, oh, what's this going to do to our FX, right? Your foreign exchange, like value that we've been like accumulating, like, like dragons sitting on gold. They're not actually too affected by that directly. I mean, they're indirectly probably, everyone's affected by it. There's the Volcker shock story about Volcker shock causing the Soviet collapse, which I actually don't think is, has some truth to it, but I think it's been overplayed. But yeah, I don't think that it really is a very autarkic economy. It aspires towards autarky. It's not autarkic, of course, no one is, even North Korea isn't, but they'd like to be in some ways. That's the institutional bias of that system.
Okay, so I promise I will wrap up after this, but like the one last question. Okay. The one last question I have to ask is one thing that really interests me because of my research is I study US-India relations, but like Nehru and like a lot of other Indian leaders are like really into the Soviet Union. And so my question is, since you've spent time in the Soviet records and Soviet archives, how invested is the Soviet Union is in spreading its idea of modernity to like the global South? Because I know it's into it in Eastern Europe.
It's super invested in it, right? Like that's a huge thing. And, I can give you the historic, like the references, because there are a lot of people writing about that. They've done excellent work, right, on just exactly how that works. And I've cited them more than I've done the actual legwork. It's hugely invested because their whole thing is, there is a development. They have their own version of development doctrine. Plenty of people, including me, have written about this, right? Their development doctrine is you develop by building steel plants via internal resources so you can develop proletarians if you don't have them, so that eventually you can like have socialist transformation. But if you don't have proletarians, you got to get those first. I think the deep irony of that is that Russia in 1917 doesn't have too many of those either. One of the funnier things is that you sometimes, Chris Miller's the right person to talk to about this. Like sometimes Soviet foreign policy advisors will be like distinctly critiquing the Soviet Union in their development advice, but they can't say it out loud. And that causes some confusion, especially with people like Mao, who really believe in it all and think they're being sabotaged, when in reality, They can't tell you don't do what we did, collectivize.
That's amazing.
Intention, to say the least.
That's also really amazing because, like, the Soviets are really interested in steel. That's how their development doctrine sort of develops. But, like, in my argument, the Americans are just really obsessed with dams, and so it's fascinating.
So are the Soviets. Dams actually like play a distinctly interesting part in like my book, in discs.
It all comes back to dams every time.
It all comes back to dams every time.
You know why? Because the cost of capital for a dam, like you have to, like essentially the Soviet Union doesn't have an interest rate officially. That's one of the things that's missing. You have to realize that it exists when you build dams, right? Because the upfront cost of dams is really high. There's a high capital.
Massive.
And then you get like free electricity. And they're building crazy amounts of dams because it looks like they're getting something for nothing. And then they realize, oh no. So it's actually the electrical engineers, led by Malenkov's wife, who begin to reintroduce the idea of an interest rate into Soviet planning through the back door. And guess who? Well, one of the reasons Malenkov loses to Khrushchev to get back to the death of Stalin is he's the first Soviet official to say, actually, we should stop industrializing and invest in consumer goods and light industry because the returning cost of capital to building more steel plants is really low. Is like there's no return anymore on it. Guess where he gets that? His wife.
The dams
of the power engineering school, and is like, like one of she's a fascinating woman. And like, guess who is one of the most radical reformers in the 60s during the Kosygin era is a man named Vag, who is the head of the economics department there and worked under her.
Wow.
This is why I'm saying this is why dams are like the coolest thing to study. Because I did know that the Soviets, they do help build dams, like not just in India, but like a bunch of Eastern European countries too. Everywhere.
You know about that like secret dissertation about Egypt?
No, there's a secret dissertation about Egypt?
I'll tell you this offline, but there's this dissertation about the Aswan Dam that never got published because the person who like wrote it decided to switch and like do gender studies and theater and never published her PhD disc, even though it was absolutely brilliant.
This is what you get when you stay until like 10 after. You find about the secret dissertation.
And I can.
Okay, so we do have to wrap up. I do want to thank Rachel for filling in for Matt. Thank you so much for the medialist for filling in. Thank you, Rachel. And most importantly, thank you to Yakov for telling us about,
the funnest
capitalism is bad, but it's not that bad. So,
Everyone remember that.
Everyone remember that. Capitalism is horrible, but not that horrible.
I'm going to link you. I'll send you the disc title like as soon as we got off because it's one of the best disc things I've ever read.
So excited. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.